Thank you very much. I'll try and be as succinct and as brief as possible so that we can have a good exchange of views and opinions. Let me start with the obvious that most people have simply forgotten. The European Union is the most successful peace project that the world has ever seen. I'll repeat it. Sorry. Let me start with the obvious that for many people, even in this room, have simply forgotten or taken for granted. The European Union, the European project, is the most successful peace project that the world has ever seen, certainly what Europe has seen. Not my words, John Hume's. We ignore that fact at our peril. But the people who, for example, negotiated the different institutions, including the Common Agricultural Policy, were people who, in their teens and early 20s, had direct experience not just of poverty, but actually of starvation. The winter of 1947 was one of the cruelest, and the damage that the last year of the Second World War did to agricultural output was such that literally the men, and there were mostly men in those days, who negotiated the Common Agricultural Policy, which we remember as the Wine Lake and the Butter Mountain, were actually speaking from direct experience. Europe was never going to starve again. And I could go on and on. That narrative has now gone into history. Our children, and certainly our grandchildren, see, as I noticed with my own young son when he was in his teens, that Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and Adolf Hitler were all part of the same time history blog, which was the past. No differentiation. And what I just stated in my opening remarks has now found itself in that space. So we're going to have to find a new way of mobilizing the emotional commitment to what the European project is from a generation of people who have no experience of starvation. And how do we do that? The collapse of communism and the alternative economic and social model is the second thing that we have to recognize as having a profound effect. Up until that particular time, there were two alternative models. And in the early stages of the Soviet Union and post-war in Central and Eastern Europe, the actual economic performance and output of the communist bloc was more impressive and more successful than its Western European counterpart. But we all know what happened to that in the end. So we're now left with a continent which incidentally is a political entity that has outside states that want to join. I can't think of anybody or any country that wants to become the 51st state of the United States, or wants to join part of China, or anywhere else. So how is it that this incredibly successful defiance of history and its replacement, not just with democracy, but also with the rule of law, it has seemed to get into the space where it is equally attacked? And I would think that the first thing that has happened, and it has happened in this country, is all of the successes that Ireland has succeeded politically, and I put my hand up as being part of governments that claim those successes, were Irish successes. All of the problems that we had was that bloody European Union and Brussels. Famously, Sheila de Valera, who had minister responsibility for culture, including natural spaces for conservation, denounced them in her own constituency, even though she had been around the table when they were agreed, and she got away with it. So we have to, first of all, as journalists, as citizens, and as professionals of whatever walk of life we're in, we have to actually confront these simply mistruths, fake facts, whatever you want to call about it, to restore a certain set of balance. But that still doesn't get us to where we want to be, because even if you were to do those sorts of things, you would still have this resentment to the European Union. But this isn't new. Governments, single-state governments, going back to just take our own state here, through the 1920s and 30s, there has been resentment to the government of the day. That resentment now has been able to divert itself or add itself to a wider level of resentment, and it gets fueled by opportunistic politicians, opportunistic columnists, and opportunistic, if you like, agitateurs or whatever way you want to talk to them, about them. Earlier, the observation that was made that the divide now in Europe is not necessarily about class, but that it's more got to do with education and age. And our young people who have that benefit have to, I think, be mobilised with a new kind of narrative and a new kind of faith in the institution of the European Union. And that's a task that we all have to face. The globalisation of the world's economy is not going to go away. The lack of education for people who thought, since they were the fourth generation of metal bashers, either in the north of England or in the Rust Belts of America, that they'd ever needed to have much of an education because the job was simply waiting for them to happen. That process, which we heard already in the previous discussion of possibly, I think it was yourself, Pat, who raised it, the driverless car or the train, that process of mechanisation of jobs that were there for life is not going to stop. And we have to be prepared to move to actually get it changed and to ensure that the negative social aspects that it can bring about are modified, if not reduced or minimised. Easy to say, I'm not entirely sure how you might go about doing it. But in the world of politics, of which I've had a lot of experience, there has been a detachment between the experience of politicians and the daily experience of other citizens. And it came as a consequence of what was initially a very good idea. Most democratic assemblies, starting with our own Oireachtas, or Westminster, or many other democratic societies within Western Europe, had people who had life experience, who then got elected, whatever political party they choose to apply to join and work through the ranks, and ended up, after maybe 10 years or so, in the real world, as you might call it, with either commercial experience or trade union experience or legal experience. And the parliamentary timetable was designed around the reality that people actually had a day job, which is why Leinster House didn't open really for business until 4 o'clock, when the trade union officials, who largely ran the Labour Party, and the lawyers could do their business down in the law courts and come up to Dáil Éireann at 4:30 in effect and stay working until 10:30, which is what they did. Then there was a demand for, let's have more assistance, let's have more family-friendly hours, let's have political assistance, etc. We have created, not consciously, but consequently, a whole group of people, special political advisors, as they're called, SPADs, I think they're called in Britain. We have them in our own country and in our own parties, across the parties, and they move from university qualification to working as a political assistant to a deputy or a senator in their own party, whatever, who then move and become maybe a senator or fill the vacancy. And for some, they've never actually had a working experience in their lives. And I think this has created a divide. First of all, they socialise with each other. A lot of the time, they're not working side by side with people who are living, for want of a better word, in the real economy. For 10 years, I worked, 8 years after I became a TD, as a commercial architect in a private sector practice in Dublin. On a number of occasions, we were approached, I was a junior partner, we were approached by people who wanted to engage us to do some work, and it emerged that they really wanted some political insiders access, which they thought I could provide. And I said, look, we sell architecture in this office. If you want to see me, come and see me at my clinic on a Sunday morning. You now have across the whole of Europe, within the European Parliament and all of the democratic assemblies, a group of well-meaning, well-intentioned people in the political world who have become detached, in my view, from what's actually happening. And that has to be reversed in some way, and I'm not entirely sure how we can do it. But to come to really the end of what I want to say in these formal remarks, populism is not a new phenomenon, but it has been given a new burst of energy by social media. and the social media that we currently have is simply toxic. You've read recently what has happened in the United Kingdom, in the British House of Commons, etc. And this is not necessarily the first time that something like this has happened. It happened before, about 150 years after the industrial printing was invented, with the printing of scurrilous pamphlets, which make some of our social media comments today absolutely peaceful encounters compared to what was. And not the Victorians, but the British establishment, I suspect it probably happened elsewhere in other parts of Europe, of which I'm not familiar. I can only speak from my knowledge of the history of what happened in London. They eventually got a legal device which effectively held the printer of the document liable for penalties, severe penalties, if they published something that was scurrilous or inflammatory or causing offence of that kind. We have to find, it seems to me, some kind of a device or some mechanism that will police the channels of social media that is as rigorous as the defamatory types of printing of scurrilous, libelous material has happened in the past. But to do that, we have to rein in the big engines that drive social media. And I don't see that there's a political appetite there for that. And I think it could only probably come about by acting and working through the European Union. So that's really what I want to say. A lot of people now that I know would not want their children or their adult children to go into politics. This has been expressed by a lot of different people for all of those reasons. There was, when Bertie Ahern was seeking to get re-elected to the Dáil as the incoming Taoiseach, which he succeeded in doing in a minority government in 1997, in the run-up to that long-signalled election campaign, Ray McSharry was the coordinator of it, and PJ Mara was on it, and they decided that it would be great to strengthen the Fianna Fáil ticket if they could get famous sons and daughters, or daughters of famous politicians, family names in different constituencies. And they went on a kind of a tour to see if they could add to the list a recognisable name. And they got, according to PJ, who told me the story, they got three kinds of reactions. Not equally spread out, but three kinds of reactions. The first was when they opened the door. The question was, you what? You want me to go into politics? Not in a million days, not after what I saw happen to this family. The second reaction was, yeah, I'd be kind of interested, but I better talk to herself and see what her attitude might be. And herself had, well, you know, you're married to me, not to politics, make your own choice. And the third one was, yeah, that's a great idea, I'd really like to do that. How much does it pay? And the figure was given, and he said, well, who's going to pay the other half of my current salary? So the way in which politics has evolved, the way in which the professionalisation of it has improved the performance of political discourse in our parliament, and the way in which things are held up to scrutiny is infinitely better now than it was when I was first elected to Leinster House in 1977. But there was an unanticipated cost to that, and that was the lack of respect for politicians across the spectrum, the discounting of anything that a politician might do, again across the spectrum, and a kind of incitement coming from different angles that basically politicians were essentially crooked, but just hadn't been found out yet. Now, whether politicians as a class, as a group, contributed and made that inevitable, or whether, in fact, you have that kind of situation in any profession, in any activity, that's a matter for people to express their own judgment. But we need to address the disregard for people who are making democracy work. Otherwise, we will take our democratic institutions for granted, and we will not get the kind of outcomes that we think should come from that. Thank you very much indeed.